Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jenner for Card Runners, and I'm here with a on-the-go hand replay. And as usual, we're not just going to be talking about our hand, but we'll talk about what we should do with our entire range. So here we are on the small blind playing no limit 100. It folds to the button, he min raises, we 3-bet, and he calls. So I'm not sure whether or not, in theory, this is going to be a 3-bet preflop. The Jack-8 suited versus a button open. Against a button open, we do need to defend very aggressively from the blinds. We need to 3-bet very often, but Jack-8 suited's probably close, so this isn't something that's solvable, so I don't really have a strong opinion either way. I definitely think in practice this can be a very profitable 3-bet, since it's very common for the button to open too wide and fold too much to 3-bets. So this, again, I'm not sure what's correct in theory here, but it's probably going to be fine and profitable in practice very often. All right, so let's see the flop. Okay, so ace, king, jack with a flush draw. So the first thing I would notice about this board is I think it's probably going to hit the 3-bet calling range quite well. And one thing that's very easy to do is when you see this board, you usually think, oh snap, it hits the 3-betting range, because you're used to 3-betting a lot of high cards. But in reality, the button should be calling 3-bets with hands like ace-jack, maybe ace-queen. You know, ace-queen can maybe be 4-bet or called depending on how aggro you're 3-betting. But ace-queen's probably called, ace-jack's almost certainly called, ace-10's called, king-jack's called, king-queen's called. Probably even queen, at least queen-10 suited's called, queen-10 off might also be called as well. And all those hands hit very well on this flop. Whereas if we're 3-betting in the small blind, we're actually probably 3-betting like a lot of suited connectors and suited gappers as bluffs. So if the board comes like 8 high, like let's say the board comes like 8, 6, 3 with a flush draw, that's kind of the board that usually hits the 3-betting range because our suited connectors are now pairs or open-ended straight draws or gut shots. So our bluffs, our 3-bet bluffs preflop got good. And then if we have overpairs and stuff, our overpairs are still very strong. So this is not a board that I think is going to hit the button range harder than the small blind range. And you would want to analyze this with Flopzilla to be sure, which is something that we don't have time to do right now. But since I don't think our range is much stronger than our opponents, we have the disadvantage of being out of position. And I also don't think our hand really has the proper bluff qualities. In other words, the hands I usually like to bluff with are hands that don't have showdown value, yet have a reasonable amount of equity that they retain as the opponent's range gets stronger. I don't think Jack-8 fits that description at all. Because if we make our opponent's range stronger, then obviously the hands we make fold on the flop are the hands that a pair of jack beats. And then, even though we can make 2-pair or trips on the turn or the river, those aren't usually awesome 2-pairs or trips on this board. We can still easily be beat if we hit a jack or an 8. So I would start with checking here. The last thing to remember is a lot of people think, well, if I check fold my EV 0, that's not true. Our opponent could have 7, 6 of diamonds and decide to check it all the way down. That can happen if our opponent sees this flop and says, he doesn't want to bluff. Or maybe he decides, to check down, let's say, Jack-9 suited and we end up splitting on the river. So the EV of checking here is not 0. So even if betting here was plus EV, it does not mean it's more plus EV than checking. And just since our hand, I don't think, has the right bluff qualities, we are out of position, and I think our opponent's range is probably as strong, if not stronger than ours. And that might even depend on whether or not queen 10 off's in his range. So you'll have to use Flopzilla and assign a range and see what you think. But between all those factors, I would start with checking here. So hero bets, villain calls, okay. So now we're going to run into that problem that I just talked about on the flop, which is we don't really retain our equity with our flop bet. So on this turn, it's kind of like, what do we do? So I would start with checking the turn. I don't think this hand's good enough to use as a bluff. Again, it doesn't have the right bluffing qualities, so I would just check. Okay, and then we bet again. I do not like this. So at this point, I think we're just bluffing with a hand that doesn't really work well as a bluff. I know I'm getting repetitive with that. And we're just stabbing at the pot because we don't know what else to do. We got to just, I think, give this one up because our opponent's range hits really well here and he has the advantage of position. We can't win them all. All right, and then the river comes a 5 of spades. So these are questions that people often like to ask, but this river spot, if someone asked me what I think they should do here, I would almost say, who cares? We probably have already misplayed 2 streets, and we probably severely misplayed the turn. like if someone showed me this hand, they might have a leak for really understanding what types of hands should be bluffed. So I would just take that information from having analyzed the hand and not worry too much about the river spot and just plan on not getting here with this hand again. So the river brought the flush draw. We have a 5 of spades. I would probably, I mean, the river I think is more bluffable now because our opponent might have jammed somewhere if he had a flush draw. People like to jam turns with flush draws in 3-bet pots since the stack depth is good for it. Our opponent might have gone all in on the turn with a hand like ace-jack or king-jack already since he might not have wanted to give a free card. So the river bluff is probably more reasonable than the other streets, but as I mentioned, I would just not get to the river with jack-8 suited here again. So I imagine he went all in on the river. Yeah, he did. Because once a player's already bluffed the flop in the turn, and then now the river is actually probably the best spot of the 3 to bluff, I expect him to bluff. But again, our opponent should probably be calling the river often enough to keep us indifferent to bluffing or very close to it. So this isn't a spot that I feel that passionately about for this hand. So here I feel passionately about do not bet the turn. I feel passionately about play around with Flopzilla to understand why the flop's probably not a bet. See what range you're giving him and get a sense for why this board, the ace, king, jack, hits the cold calling range much better than you're likely thinking. But as for the river, whether you bluff or not, I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. All right, and he happens to call here, such is life. All right, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video. Hopefully you learned something. So good luck at the tables and take care.